Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, who's a philosopher of mind and metaphysics, and who specializes in the thought of Whitehead, Nietzsche, and Spinoza. In his field, he pertains specifically to panpsychism and altered states of consciousness, and he is a field researcher and fellow lecturer at the University of Exeter. Today, we're here to discuss a paper that he recently published, and which I think is not only fascinating, but incredibly important to open up discussions at this intersection, which is the need for metaphysics in psychedelic therapy and research. And I'll leave a link in the description to that paper if you're interested in reading it for yourself. So specifically, well, first off, welcome, Peter, to the channel. And second, thank you for this paper. So could you maybe just introduce yourself and maybe a little bit of the meaning and the motivation behind writing this specific paper?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm glad we finally meet inverted commas. So yeah, as you said, I'm a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Exeter in Devon, Britain. I consider myself really a philosopher of mind and metaphysics, so not in the analytic tradition that much, but a little bit. This paper, which came out in Frontiers last month on the need for metaphysics and psychedelic therapy and research, why it came about like this. Well, at Exeter University, we've got a big psychedelic research group. We have a colloquium, have talks every 2 weeks, more or less, in term time. And, my I also teach philosophy of mind and so on at the university. And we have a number of guest lecturers in, David Rizzo, Chris Timmerman, people like that, who are, working on the neuroscience and clinical practice of administering psychedelics for therapy against, depression, anxiety, fear, addiction, stuff like that. And usually the therapy involves 3 stages. So you have the sort of preparatory stage where the patient or the participant gets to know their therapists, often male and female. And then there's the drug session, whatever it may be, psilocybin. We do a lot of ketamine at Exeter. I should reword that. There's a lot of research in ketamine therapy at Exeter. And but whatever, we're actually in Exeter now. We're also doing phase 2 trials on 5-MeO-DMT with Berkeley Scitech, I think they're called, yeah. Anyway, so we've got the practical side of things and theoretical from the philosophical part, like me and Christine Hauskeller and so on. Celia Morgan is the professor of psychology there, working ketamine and so on. Anyway, we had these lecturers and they were talking about it's 3 phases: a preparatory stage, the drug stage, the drug session itself, and then the integrative stage. And I was always interested in this integrative stage because it means, like integrating the experience into one's life in terms of one's problems. If you think you have problems, if they're determined to be problems, that's another philosophical issue, normalizing characteristics. But anyway, I always asked about this integrative stage, and it was always a bit ambiguous. Well, we speak to them about, what happened and so on and so forth, but then looking into it, I realized there's many different forms of integration. There's no standard at all. There's 8 main, as I say in my paper, there's 8 main strands, but that's changing constantly. So I decided to look into it, and then I realized that what seems to be most therapeutic in terms of therapy is that one has this sort of experience, which I've now called a metaphysical experience, where one sees the grander picture. One sees life one sees oneself as a small part of something much greater. And that often is something monistic, classically, from Plotinus, but also, Spinoza to a certain extent, or whatever. There's many different philosophies that can capture these experiences. But of course, the therapists don't know anything about metaphysics. They're not trained in metaphysics. One of the reasons is, as you know, in the 20th century, metaphysics was a bad word. And we only really passed the metaphysical turn about 20, 30 years ago. And even that is, pretty dry analytic metaphysics, like understanding causation as subjective conditionals, whatever it may be, right? It's not the great systems of the past. So I distinguish, sort of analytic metaphysics as we have at universities today, which I've taught, and systematic metaphysics. So that would be Hegelianism, Spinozism, whatever. Anyway, people having these amazing experiences where they see themselves as a small part of a greater universe, a greater cosmos, and have this experience, and then they want to talk about it. But the therapist doesn't know anything about it. And this is why psychedelic therapy is very distinct from normal forms of therapy. You have these amazing, fundamentally metaphysical experiences, experiential metaphysics. So my proposal then in the paper is that, well, why don't you bring metaphysics into the equation? Why don't you bring metaphysics into the integrative stage at least, which will mean that a number of these experiences can be explored in ways that might make them more significant and intelligible and believable to a lot of participants. Because one of the if you have this, when you have this experience, the mechanism is generally believed to be, although it's early science, that your life is very trivial in comparison to the cosmos, therefore your little problems are really trivial as well, so therefore you don't need to mask them with addictions and so on. But if you had such an experience, let's say a pantheistic one, and then you return to England, or you're wherever, Germany, whatever country you're in, you sort of return to the default, you settle back into the default ideology, which is always, an ideology, you can't escape it, I don't think. And then you think maybe that experience was completely deluded, complete rubbish. And then that way of thinking about the world has no effect upon you at all. But with the metaphysical integration, you can actually give credence to a number of these experiences, by using some of the great philosophers. Of course, it can't be at the level of academic philosophy, but that's the next step, making this intelligible to lay people, and I think it's possible actually. So that's the general motive for creating all of this.
I think there's so many threads there that I want to dive into, but I just want to sort of first just express a simple affirmation of how I think important this project is in general, and thinking through this project. So just sort of to re-emphasize that in the context of psychedelic therapy, you usually have a situation where people might have an analytic background, they might have a more general psychotherapeutic background, and they might also have, at least in this context, they might also have experience with psychedelics, but philosophy is being left out of the picture. Metaphysics is being left out of the picture. And I just want to first relate this back to my personal experience, which is when I was first exposed to psychedelics, I was exposed to psychedelics in perhaps a way that had no integrative container, had no integrative sort of after moment, and you're sort of left blown open. Without, with this contact with something like you're saying, this experience of something much greater and grander than yourself, but no real way to sense make or mediate that process. And actually, in my context, what naturally happened was I started getting into philosophy. So psychedelics was an open. So in some sense, basically, my quote unquote integration was what you're saying, which is basically once you're exposed to psychedelics, one possible avenue for integration is this mediation of philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. And I think that's probably the experience of many undergraduates I get. They just want to make sense of this experience, which seemed very real to them at the time. I've had a number of students like that, and creates people's lives, doesn't it? I mean, it changes your life fundamentally, I think.
Absolutely. I guess my personal experience was going into the psychedelic experience. I could be classified metaphysically as a type of secular evolutionist, would probably be the most general category. And then after the psychedelic experience, that world picture just did not satisfy in the same way. And so I was opened in a dramatic way, and in a way that was, again, something which opened me up to, broadly speaking, let's say, a more idealist discourse. in that direction anyway.
I mean, this is the funny case of A.J. Ayer, you know, the great British logical positivist. I mentioned it in the paper. But he had,
I appreciated that one.
Yeah, I mean, he says, you know, what was the 1930s paper on the impossibility of metaphysics? I think it was called. You know, he was seminal in sort of destroying metaphysics as a proper, you know, respectable science. But then he had what I would call a psychedelic experience. It wasn't induced by psychedelic chemicals. It was induced by salmon getting stuck in his throat when he had pneumonia. But nonetheless, if you read the experience, which he wrote in the Sunday Telegraph in the late 80s, it's basically a psychedelic experience. Sounds like an LSD experience to me. And he came out and he said, you know, I still don't believe in God. However, I'm very open-minded now to possibilities of life after death or consciousness after death. I'm not sure about it, but you know, and that was just one experience. I think it's very interesting that it happened to him because of his background. You know, he was like sort of Richard Dawkins type of his age in the 70s, and you know, he that one experience changed him. So if it changed him, imagine what it would do to other philosophers. Not that I don't think anyone becomes dogmatic and doesn't switch one into some kind of ideology, but I think it generally opens up your mind to other possibilities, and that's it. But yeah, you know, so it's I think it's, but this is where philosophy, you know, philosophy is often, generally speaking now, philosophy is often you know, the stereotype is it's, you know, carried out in ivory towers and has no practical applicability. But here now, with this new industry emerging, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, philosophy, I think, has direct practical application, and it should not, shouldn't avoid it now, you know. So I'm just, that paper's just waving the flag. It's like, listen, everyone, you know, this might be useful. Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that another interesting aspect of, you know, sort of how you're framing these three stages is also the conversation at the intersection between philosophy and psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, is that oftentimes these two disciplines are also seen as disconnected. So like maybe if you train as a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist, you do so in such a way as that you're not really in contact with core philosophy like a Spinoza or like a Hegel. And then on the other hand, you might have someone who's trained as a philosopher in a Spinoza or a Hegel and then doesn't have any psychotherapeutic or psychoanalytic background. And so I think that's another interesting aspect of your method. Could you go into a little bit about how you might see the relationship between these fields, which are often conceptualized differently or separately?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's very interesting avenue of thought there, because I suppose I'll start with the history a bit. You know, Freud was was influenced by Spinozism, and there's a book on it actually called Clinical Spinoza. And you know, the term the oceanic feeling, which is used in like questionnaires now for psychedelic experiences in therapy and clinics in neuroscience. That was termed by you know, the poet Romain Rolland in his correspondence with Freud. So Freud said, you know, these experiences are just sort of illusions. Maybe they hark back to childbirth or being in the womb. But Romain Rolland was sort of saying, no, listen, we have to really think about these greater possible truths. And he's speaking about Spinozism to a certain extent. And he then coined the term oceanic boundlessness or oceanic feeling. So that sort of inspired psychoanalysis. But then after that, of course, that was all lost. And it became pretty, you know, pretty secular and dry in that sense. And it wasn't, I doubt it's Spinozism is taught in any psychoanalysis these days, but I might be wrong. It's not my field. And then on the other side, you know, modern psychology was developed by William James, really. I mean, a lot of people point to his Principles of Psychology in 1890 as a development of scientific psychology, that, you know, but in those books, you read those two principal books, I mean, they are, half of it is philosophy of mind. We classify it as philosophy of mind today, you know, relationship between mind and matter and stuff like that. And then, of course, William James, 1902, you know, 12 years later, wrote Varieties of Religious Experience, which is really the basis of modern psychedelic research today, you know, like talking about the mystical experience through the 4 criteria and so on. And then, you know, later in life, you know, like what became known as pluralistic universe, William James is fusing Hegel, Fechner, and Bergson into some interesting kind of cosmopsychism, really. But again, that's lost in modern psychology. So there was this loss of philosophy in psychology in the 20th century. And why? Well, a number of reasons. I think partly the influence of Marxism, in the West, partly scientific endeavor was trying to get rid of other forms of knowledge. To a certain extent, logical positivism, behaviorism made the way for that. Metaphysics then was derailed, even though it was a core pillar of philosophy, originally, of course, one of the three core pillars. And then, yeah, we've sort of lost, and science as we know it today used to be called natural philosophy. It was part of philosophy, and as part of it, you'd always see it in the broader picture. If you look at the work of Humphrey Davy, for example, who was pioneering psychonaut, took 200 pints of nitrous oxide. He wrote a poem called Spinozist. He was very interested in idealism, Kant, and so on, as was Coleridge, Wordsworth. So, but that connection to philosophy was drained, really. And now we've got these sciences which are drained of philosophy coming back into what you might call then metaphysical, philosophic experiences, and not knowing what to do with them. So that's so that intersection is kind of natural, but it's it's only becoming clear now, I think, as the psychedelic renaissance, so-called, comes back into being. That why didn't it happen in the 60s is an interesting question as well, right? Because when the 60s was, when LSD came into play, really, with Albert Hofmann, Leary, in the academe at the time, philosophy of mind, consciousness studies was at the most, reductive level, eliminativism, as I said, logical behaviorism, and so on. Consciousness wasn't even real, let alone psychedelic consciousness. So there's no academic interest in it at all. Plus, then it was, seen as recreational and criminal. And so, this great opportunity was lost to investigate it. I mean, just before that, there was, Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, who coined the word psychedelic, who was a psychiatrist who worked in Canada, and England. He was English. They had planned this conference called Outsight, where they would get 50 of the leading intellectuals of the world. They wanted to include A.J. funnily enough, but also Einstein, Jung, and many others, and give them all mescaline, and create it into this philosophical, intellectual endeavor. But it never happened. They didn't get the funding. So a lot of lost opportunities related to criminalization, to historical ideological trends. It's very complex etiology, causal network. But anyway, that's to even begin an answer to that question. You have to look at all these facets.
Oh, it's a fascinating window into to my mind, maybe the most interesting relationship to study, or at least one of them. I mean, there's many interesting relationships to study, but certainly this relationship between psychology broadly speaking and philosophy broadly speaking is one, as you've outlined really well, is something that seems to be tremendously mishandled in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And yeah,
there was, I mean, I know you're I don't know if you've ever, I know you're a Hegelian to some extent, or you teach Hegel, but I don't know if you ever looked into British Hegelians, the British idealists, people like F.H. Bradley, Green, and so on. They were already at that time, so in late 1800s, like 1880, 1890s, starting to complain about psychology becoming a science and losing the general metaphysical context in which they operated. So, and they were right to fear that, because that's exactly what happened. I'm just glad that Exeter now, they're pretty open-minded to bringing in philosophy back into psychology and bringing it back into science now. I see this as the future.
Well, it's a weird thing with, it's a weird thing with personal identity and philosophers. Do I identify as this or do I identify as that? But certainly, the philosophers I teach with that philosophy portal are philosophers who have, let's say, inspired me the most, or something like that. And certainly we all sort of develop our own relationship to certain philosophers for whatever reason. But one of the things that tremendously inspired me on the path that I'm currently following is a living philosopher, Slavoj Žižek. And Slavoj Žižek inspired me because primarily in his book, Less Than Nothing, he's basically putting Freud into perspective and conversation with Hegel. And so it's very interesting. And like, I see his big project being basically the relationship between German idealism and psychoanalysis. Like, if there was a simplification of Zizek, it would be that. It would be like, to me, it would be, what is philosophy after psychoanalysis? That would be, to me, one of Zizek's big projects. But it's interesting to me to consider your work in that perspective, not because it's reducible to that perspective, but just because you're also putting, figures like Spinoza into conversation with Freud. And so basically it's this conversation of what is the relationship between big picture continental philosophical systems and modern psychology or modern psychotherapy or modern, that's a big conversation, I think.
Yeah. That's where psychedelics come in, because they bring one back to experiential metaphysics, so you can't avoid it. But it's interesting what you say about Zizek working on psychoanalysis and Hegelianism or Hegelism. William James wrote an essay called on Hegelism, I think it was, where he talks about nitrous oxide in this giant footnote. But I would, critical theory, of course, is the combination really of psychoanalysis and Marx, isn't it? So to sort of then go backwards and compare it to Hegel. Well, I've read some of Zizek's work. I've met him a few times, but I've never really, I should I will take a greater look at his work.
To me, Zizek's big work is less than nothing, but there's obviously other books and there are people who will say other things. But the crucial move, and we don't need to go deep down that rabbit hole, but just because you make that point about critical theory, is that Zizek's move is basically asking the question, what would Hegel say to Marx? Instead of just going with the standard linear trajectory of Hegel to Marx, and then assuming Marx sort of sublates Hegel. But we don't need to go. What I really wanted to isolate here, which I think is so crucial in your paper, is this relationship between, and this distinction, which I would love to discuss at length, the distinction between mysticism and metaphysics. Because I feel like you make that distinction throughout the paper, and I think that's such an important distinction. And just to discuss this a little bit at length, because I see there's a lot at stake here within psychedelic communities broadly. There's obviously this tendency towards mysticism, but you make the point over and over again that mysticism can't be just reduced into metaphysics, can't be reduced to mysticism.
No. Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting, complex relationship. And again, one of the reasons I even created some images for that, I think 2 images, right? It was because it's so, again, in the colloquium, but also papers I read and conferences I went to in the last 10 years, it's so common for people to conflate mysticism, supernaturalism, spirituality, metaphysics into one clump. And so I remember one of the first talks that was given, they basically put like metaphysics / spirituality / supernaturalism. I said, what do you mean by these terms? Like, well, I don't know, it's like on the questionnaire, right? They're just like, no clue. And that's why it's important to make this distinction for a number of reasons, as you point out. I think one of them is scientists, you can be a Spinoza. I mean, where shall I start? There's no getting away from metaphysics, like scientists who think they're working neutrally, and I know a lot of them now, they think they don't have a metaphysics. Of course they do. It's generally physicalism of a certain stripe, right? And you can trace it back historically as to why they believe that, generally. So the first thing is, you have to, as you know, metaphysics and philosophy has quite a strict, well, not strict, it's somewhat precise definition, and got nothing to do with the New Age, or very little to do with it. It's not the same thing as spiritualism or religion. It's, it comes from Aristotle's book. The metaphysics, or the word, comes from that, which wasn't even named by him. And then the contents of that book really have at least triggered what we understand by metaphysics today. So questions about, what is substance, what is causation, relations, modalities, stuff like that. Of course, that's been augmented since, but it still provides a blueprint for what metaphysics is today. And it's a secular endeavor. I mean, okay, book Lambda in the metaphysics was about God, the prime mover. Whitehead said this was, Aristotle provided the first and last non-religious God, right, in Western thought. But I think one of many useful things of distinguishing them, metaphysics and mysticism, is that metaphysics doesn't need to be religious in any way. It can be, but needn't be. So in that sense, it becomes more neutral. When you talk about mysticism, often, and that's an ambiguous term as well, or much more ambiguous than metaphysics, often, there's a religious element there. I mean, like, for example, in William James's book, Varieties of Religious Experience, the last chapters are on mysticism. So that's one thing. So I think you can present metaphysics to practitioners, secular practitioners, and say, this is a legitimate framework in which to understand things, which doesn't make you religious or anything, right? There's that fear always in the academy. That's one thing. The other thing is mysticism, almost by definition, is not an explanation of anything. It's just, there's mysticism as a practice, but then mystical experience, the experience, but it doesn't explain anything. You might think that when you're having the experience, it's noetic, as William James said, like veridical, true. But you're left at a loss, still mystical. Whereas metaphysics is explanatory. And you can fit certain mystical experiences, not all perhaps, but certain mystical so-called experiences into a metaphysical framework, which then provides the rationale for the experience, which mysticism alone cannot do, which then becomes an important, can become a useful tool for integration. But of course, the real trick is always, speaking about this in intelligible terms, participants. But I think that's possible, as I say. But yeah, so, but what is the difference? Well, so metaphysics then concerns, I split it into, as I've said now, analytic metaphysics, which is the modern field, quite dry, causation, so on and so forth, mental causation, modality. And then there's systematic metaphysics. So the great thinkers, really, I'm thinking Spinozism, Hegelianism. I consider, with Collingwood, I consider Kant's philosophy to be a metaphysics, even though he says this is the counter. This is the obviously, transcendental idealism are considered to be a metaphysical viewpoint. Anyway,
well, like Kant is like, he's emphasizing a critical turn, right?
Yeah, I mean, he called it, with the critiques, and he called it actually critical. He preferred the term, didn't he? Critical idealism, I seem to remember. But nonetheless, it is an idealism, and
yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, so. What is mystical experience? Well, I've got as you can see in the paper, the first thing when you talk about that, when you approach that subject, you're immediately, first of all, confronted with problems before you can define it. So one is there are multiple definitions, sometimes contradictory. Secondly, there's this debate that by talking about mystical experience, you're almost being not imperialist, but there's this debate between perennialism, that the peak mystical experience is metacultural, so it doesn't matter what culture you're from, the experience will be the same, the interpretation will differ. This is the view of William James. Aldous Huxley goes back to Agostino Stucco, counter-reformationists in the 17th century. And then on the other side, there's contextualists from Stephen Katz, really, from 1978, who believe that the experience itself, the mystical experience, is completely conditioned by culture. So we'd have radically different experiences on DMT were we from different cultures, right? And there's a third way, of course, which most people seem to take today. So some people think by mystical experience, you're just talking about, the Western cultural conditioned experiences. And then there's the other problem is, whether we take certain of these experiences to be veridical, to be true or not, And then related to that are metaphysical positions about, the relation of mind to matter. So some people think, oh, look, this person met God, but we can scan the brain and we therefore realize just the brain activity. Of course, it doesn't mean that, there's a lack of philosophy. We don't know, we know that there might be a correlation, but we don't know what that means. So, and that is another, by the way, that as a side point, that is another important application of philosophy to this debate. There's a number of papers recently in the last few years from neuroscientific studies just seem to think that we soon will be able to fully explain the psychedelic experience through neurology, neuroscience. And this is just like ignorance of what correlations mean. So
well, you emphasize in your paper it's not brain manifesting, it's mind manifesting.
It's the definition of psychedelics. Yeah, exactly. So so there's another movement to create non-phenomenological psychedelics, which is really an oxymoron, because psychedelic means mind manifesting. That's how it was defined by Osmond. And so if we're going to stick to the pure etymology, I think we should stick to that. Some people even restrict psychedelics to those that act on the serotonin receptors, so thereby excluding ketamine, nitrous oxide, even salvia divinorum, which is a highly potent drug.
Yeah, I was actually in a very unethical situation. I was given salvia without being told it was salvia.
Ooh, that's dangerous.
And that was just not a good experience. But
the most power, that and very, as potent as DMT, I think. It's like incredibly powerful. Yeah. So, but not to say that's not a psychedelic, I think it's verging on the absurd. When psychedelic means,
I would agree.
And also look at the original paper by Osmond, 1957. He talks about William James's relationship to nitrous oxide in that very paper there, where he coined psychedelics. So anyway, this is a whole other discussion. It's just a linguistic issue, but I think we should be open to what psychedelic means, not close it.
So this distinction between mysticism and metaphysics, I do think it's so important, because, and let me just report what I see from the field, and at least let's see what, if my framing of it, let's see how you what, if you see the same thing, or if you see the same concern.
Okay.
So here's my concern, is that on the one, and I've seen this happen on both sides many times now, is on the one side, let's say you could go to the extreme mystical side, where you just get infatuated with the immediacy of the psychedelic experience itself, and you just get sucked into that experience, and you sort of detach from your ego or your normal historical self-consciousness and your all the things like related to your embodied life and work life and career maybe, and your relationship to society and all that. On the other side, I've seen an extreme move into fundamentalist religion, which I would call the let's say the unmediated metaphysical side, where you just jump to a metaphysical system which is already pre-made and given for you, and already set up with institutions and books which just give you the answer to it. So on the one side, the just pure mystical side; on the other side, the unmediated metaphysical side, which would be a fundamentalist religious side. And that what's at stake to me, and this is, I guess, this is like reading your paper, I was actually deeply reflecting on what am I doing? And I feel like in some sense, the philosophical path is the mediated path between these two, which is that you wrestle with the great metaphysical systems, and you try to work out, what is my relationship to these fundamental concepts, and what is the relationship between mind and matter, and you stay with this as a as an open question, as a mystery, but one in which is intelligible in some sense.
Yeah, so in that sense, philosophy is kind of almost like a safety net in many ways, to stop you going to the extremes, one side or the other, because it allows for reflection, and that's part of integration, really. That could help one's mental health, if that's a concern, if you believe in the concept mental health, which has normative connotations, of course. I think you're quite right, and but well, another important aspect of that, well, as part of it really, is that most people that have not studied philosophy before, they don't know what it is. I'm often asked, what is philosophy anyway? Let alone do they know what metaphysics is? And generally, you see this even in academics who haven't studied philosophy. There's this general belief that either you're a dualist, so you believe, in the substance sense, so the soul, exists beyond the body, or you're a physicalist in some ambiguous way, and that's it. Those are the only two options. And this is, I think, where philosophy can actually enrich society as well. I'm talking mostly about therapy here, but really it applies societally as well. Like it sort of just opens, you can give people so many more options of thinking about the world, and in ways which are not immediately dismissed as false. So it's not like being sort of a substance dualist Christian, let's say, or some kind of engineer physicalist. So many middle routes, or not middle, even other routes that you can take, which when one understands that these are legitimate routes in the sense that there's a legacy of intricate thought behind them all for centuries, sometimes millennia, I think it just that in itself provides a richness to a person's life, to certain people. It's not for everyone, obviously. But and as a result, I think that opening up all these options, it's like almost providing another kind of I don't know what the word is, like enrichment faculty to society. Just as we have music and dance and theatre and cinema and whatever, right? So this is another way in which we can sort of heighten the richness of humanity. Thinking long term, thinking on a general level. But I think that the problem at the moment is that philosophy is seen as, like I say, an ivory tower endeavor, and people are kind of a bit scared of it. They don't want to be sort of ridiculed or contradicted and whatever. So, but now that the psychedelic renaissance has started and is offering these philosophical sort of viewpoints, I think this is a great opportunity to sort of show people and allow people to see the beauty of philosophy, what it offers people. How it can improve one's life, not just if one's suffering, but if one is, happy.
No, I totally agree again in terms of specifically this point that philosophy can enrich society. And I think it's also important that you emphasize that this is not, and this will probably become more and more important as psychedelic assisted psychotherapy becomes more a feature of our culture, is that this is not just for therapy, but it has to also translate into society at large. And I think that's where philosophy is an imminent necessity, not just the ivory tower of doubting the world, let's say, and just having my mind map, but philosophy in the world, philosophy as part of life itself. And in your experience, what are the ways in which this path can be more, easily communicated, or in what ways can processes like the mystical experience be coupled to, for example, a philosophical program? Because basically, implicitly, what happened to me is you have a psychedelic experience, and then I was lucky enough to be in a doctoral program where I had the chance to just do philosophical research, and that actually balanced me out well. But I was thinking, how could this be more formally developed? Because I think like you have a situation where people are exposed to intense experiences. Like if you're doing research projects with 5-MeO-DMT, my goodness, then you go, then shouldn't there be some sort of logical mediation process? Like I feel like integration, like to me, the word that comes up as maybe helpful to also understand integration is logical mediation.
Yeah, that's right. Making the mystical intelligible. This is the hard part, really, because theoretically it makes good sense, but how do you bring it? How do you make it accessible? So this is so what I've done is I've created this metaphysics matrix in the paper and the glossary, which is sort of questionnaire, which actually I'm working on another paper now, validating that through factor analysis with a psychologist. But I think that practically speaking, my personal next steps are I'm going to create like a booklet, sounds crude, but like a metaphysics manual, right, for practitioners, participants, but the wider public as well, where I'm going to try to explain all these different metaphysical terms and the columns, mostly in the metaphysics matrix, in a manner that can be understood. I think it can be, because if you translate those big isms, those big words we use in philosophy into sentences, then people can make sense of it, but it's a bit of a conjecture, so we'll see how it goes. Also, in relation to that, a course, so teaching it to therapists who might want to use it as part of their therapy. I'm not saying that it's going to completely replace what they're doing. Obviously, you need to ask a person about their life and their fears and so on. You can't just go straight into Spinoza. But as part of that, as an additional tool, we're sort of about to begin to develop a course on that. But I'll be working with therapists on that course, so it's not just from my sort of armchair stance, but from people on the ground, as it were. But from the therapists I've spoken to already, and I spoke to a number of them before I wrote this. People like Ros Watts, Graham Campbell, Michelle Baker-Jones. They're all pretty positive about this project. They think that there's no real territorial, like, listen, this is the sort of psychoanalysts or the therapists, counselors field. They're pretty, I think they're pretty enthusiastic about using it, having it as an additional tool for some people. I mean, another distinction I make is that psychedelic experience doesn't have to be mystical or metaphysical either. You can get, you could just laugh, right? Laughing gas, for example, right? Or you can it could just be purely aesthetic if such a thing exists. Or it could be, when you read sort of reports from the Americas, it could just be about becoming a better warrior or a better fighter, or cursing an enemy or healing a friend or whatever, right? There's a richness, a variety of psychedelic experiences, some of which are metaphysical experiences, others are not. So, people who don't have these metaphysical experiences under psychedelics, it doesn't really apply to them.
I feel like, I feel like it's good that you make that distinction, and you make that distinction in your paper as well. And I feel like the correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the triadic system you set up in the figure in your paper, where you have three interacting loops, where there's metaphysics, mysticism, and psychedelic experience, and so they're all distinguished there. And maybe as we've already sort of started to make this distinction between metaphysics and mysticism, maybe it would be worthwhile to also go into this third distinction. Yeah, I suppose. Well, there's no such thing as the psychedelic experience, but often when they do clinical trials, at least in Britain and America, actually, the questionnaire you're given, like the MEQ, the common one, mystical experience questionnaire, it's just, like, it immediately presupposes that you've had a mystical experience. That in it's always useful. British idealists always said, to understand something, go look at its origins, right? So why are people using this questionnaire? It actually goes back to Walter Stace, a philosopher of mysticism, who wrote a book on it, The Philosophy of Mysticism, in 1960. And he creates that, basically the basis of that questionnaire, which is still being used today there. But his metaphysics, if you read that book, there's some good parts to it, but there's some poor parts to it as well. It doesn't really understand, pantheism, for example. It could be expanded on, but they're working. So all the scientists are working on this philosopher's book of the 1960, which is not great in the first place. But so the first thing to say is, psychedelic experience is multivariate, depending on dose, state of mind, setting, as they say, the type of drug. 5-MeO-DMT for me stands out as very unique and distinct from all the others, because it's not really aesthetic. It's just white light and then nothingness, but intense nothingness. It's extremely hard to explain. But anyway, it's a different league of psychedelic, that one. But they're using it, they're trialing it now for depression, treatment-resistant depression, interestingly. So there's a wide variety of psychedelic experiences. Now, some of them map onto metaphysical experiences. Those are ones like William James speaks about. He said, understood Hegel better under nitrous oxide, for example. And he also talks about the one, the absolute, referring, I believe, to Plotinus, who's like key in understanding mysticism in the West. And he was a pagan, not a Christian. Because a lot of people say mysticism is a Christian thing, It's not really a fair statement. I mean,
goes back to Plotinus, who was a pagan philosopher, the first Neoplatonist, and then it goes back to the Eleusinian mysteries even, and so on, which of course were Greek pagans. So it's not a Christian thing. There was influence later from Christianity. But so we have to distinguish psychedelic experience, which can be mystical, it can be metaphysical, and it can be something completely different. And then how do we distinguish metaphysical from mystical experience? Well, we spoke about that already a bit, but I'd say that metaphysical experience can be referred to as framework for intelligibility, whereas mysticism cannot. But some of the experiences that do overlap. So that feeling, for example, that the universe is alive, sentient, that is form of cosmopsychism or pantheism, for example, or the very, a lot of empirical studies recently have shown that, there's an increase in nature connectedness to the extent that people believe there's value, intrinsic, not just instrumental value within natural objects, plants, and whatever. So this can be referred to via panpsychism, for example. Mysticism can't account for that. And then there are metaphysical experiences that are not part of any mystical canon. So, for example, idealism. So I said William James had an idealistic sort of experience on nitrous oxide. So did Humphrey Davy, the great chemical philosopher, Penzance, a few miles away. Sir Humphrey Davy, who in 1799 took 200 pints of nitrous oxide and said, all that exists are ideas, thoughts, sensations, something like this, some kind of idealistic thing. Idealism is not part of mysticism. So by looking at these experiences through metaphysics, you can actually broaden the categories of experience beyond mysticism. Those mystical categories are like almost non-existent for the reason that, William James defined them as one of the 4 criteria of mystical experience as ineffable, like something that cannot be spoken about. So in which case, you can't really categorize it, although he does in other terms as well. But I just think, again, that metaphysics, coming back to the key point, metaphysics just provides a better, broader, more intelligible, rational, more interesting framework in which you can understand these things.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I mean, again, trying to think of what thread is best to follow here, because there's a number of interesting threads. I mean, on the first, like just on a just a reflective conversation point, I think that my experience as well is that 5-MeO-DMT is in a different league than the other psychedelic experiences, and that psychedelic experiences in general are, of course, multivariate in relationship to the substance, right? I mean, in also, like, in regards to if you're using psilocybin or LSD, they have different qualitative styles. What's your view on that? Maybe that would be interesting to...
No, they do differ generally. The question is whether, like, the high dose of anything, even so that 5-MeO-DMT experience, I've heard people talk about very high dose LSD, which seems to be indistinguishable. I just need to sign into my university account here because it's saying I've got 5 minutes left, which is not true, but I just bear with me. Okay, it's all good.
I could, is it good?
Yeah, it's just the university Zoom is just very careful. It's all good now. Where was I? So
you were talking about the different substances and whether they're all pointing towards the same general...
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to the perennialist debate again, contextualist perennialist debate. Can high dose LSD be actually qualitatively identical and maybe numerically identical to the 5-MeO-DMT experience? This is an interesting question which deserves more research. There's so much, by the way, there's another whole aspect of this. It just deserves so much more research than is being done at the moment. There's so many more books and PhDs to be written. But anyway, I think, like mescaline, for example, is seen to be more of an intellectual psychedelic because, to generalize, but often you sort of retain a kind of rational self, as it were, sort of that can analyze the experience whilst you're in the experience. Whereas with high dose acid, for example, you sort of lose that capability, that rational capability. So that provides different phenomenology. Also, another aspect to it is, the extent to which you reduce what's happening to one drug and your bodily reaction to it. So it's an interesting talk at Breaking Convention by Zuzanna Sadowska, Polish postdoc. And is she a postdoc or a PhD student? Anyway, about ayahuasca, actually, and how the context of taking it actually changes the drug, and thus your one's experience of that drug. So it's a kind of like, philosophically speaking, it means that the qualities of something are its relations. So relations are properties, as it were. It's something Whitehead really brought out in this fallacy of simple location. That a gene, Whitehead said, in a particular part of the body will be very different from a gene in another part, and this led through Waddington to the science of epigenetics. He actually, no, Whitehead said it about atoms, but Waddington applied it to genes. That's right. And so maybe when we talk about the different substances, we're sort of abstracting a little bit too much. This is another interesting research question. I don't know the answer to this, but set and setting was always like a platitude of the 60s, and maybe this can be formally analyzed, in terms of anthropology and in terms of metaphysics, in terms of relations, qualities, properties. But my experience, I think, it does seem that different types of drug do have. Nitrous oxide is very different from psilocybin, for example. No doubt about that. On these very grand levels. And then dose is very important as well, of course. And expectation is important. If you were to take Salvia divinorum without expecting it, to me, that was terrifying.
It was terrifying. Yeah, that's correct.
Whereas if you're ready for it, I would imagine you could sort of like tell yourself to go with the flow, even though it might be overwhelming.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. All of these variables are importantly to consider. And it's, in your context, very interesting that you're just pointing towards the necessity that we need more theses, we need more research about all of this. And in that regard, do you feel like the current university setting is tending in the right direction in that way?
Generally speaking, I think it's turning slowly that way. Slowly, I think. Well,
because I'm just thinking about your comment about the 1960s and that missed opportunity. And I remember reading the papers. There's a book where you have all of Timothy Leary's papers from his Harvard years, and of course he was kicked out.
Yeah.
And so it could be that the missed opportunity was a little bit of a mix of an overzealous enthusiasm, but also the institutional regulations and the resistance and the cultural pressures just pointing in the opposite way.
Yeah, it's a very complex etiology you're teasing out here. I think that I can say in Exeter University, which is pretty typical of British university, there's a big interest in 4E cognition now. So extended, embedded, embodied, and active mind. And I think this is a progress to an extent. So it's not like neuroessentialism. It's not everything is reduced to the brain in some neo-Kantian fashion, right? Because a lot of that stuff is actually based on Kant's philosophy, interestingly. It's a kind of physicalist Kantianism that is quite popular now in cognitive neuroscience. There's this 4E movement then, for those who don't know it, that we shouldn't talk about the neural correlates of consciousness. Rather, you should talk about, first step is the bodily, correlates of consciousness. So the gut, the general nervous system, and then there's a movement outside the body as well. So to the object that you are perceiving, or the object which you're interacting with, there's different varieties of this. But generally, they're sort of known as extended mind theories, although that's one part of 4E. Which means we should talk rather about sort of spatio-temporal correlates or physical correlates of consciousness for a start. So that's a move away, I think, from this strict neuroessentialism, which kind of ruled the 20th century. I actually see Christian elements in that, substance dualist elements in that, ironically, because, the sort of, maybe Roman Catholic to be more specific, but the view that only humans have souls. Descartes famously said, even as dogs don't have souls and whatever. Mind, by soul he meant mind. Well, he meant soul as well, so it's distinct from the body. But so there's a Christian element there. Only humans have souls, and I think that sort of feeds into neuroessentialism a little bit. That only a human brain really can be conscious. I mean, I was quite surprised, just as a footnote here. I was surprised a few months ago when this report came out saying maybe bees, honeybees, have basic forms of sentience. And I thought, well, why would you think they didn't? They've got brains for a start anyway, right? Even if you're a neuroessentialist. But the interesting thing about that was the reaction. Some people said, yeah, obviously, why would you? But half of people, like including Michael Pollan, who popularized psychedelics a few years ago, he said, like, this is amazing, like, who would have thought bees are sentient? And he wasn't being sarcastic, I understand it, So there's a move away from neuroessentialism, I think, and this is a move in the right direction for me, because it opens up possibilities in metaphysics, and it makes people again more interested in metaphysics, as to explore the different options. Because in the 20th century, really, it was like under the influence of one metaphysic. It wasn't anti-metaphysical. It was the physicalist metaphysic. Now, which type, that went through different phases, didn't it? So we had psychoneural identity theory in the sort of 50s, and then functionalism, which is basically physicalism, and then all the varieties of emergentism and so on. But now people just haven't got a clue. So the doors are open. I think people are more aware now of all the problems with any position you take. And so, we're at a loss. We're sort of going back to step one, really. So it's worth looking at the great thinkers of the past to see what they have said, including Plotinus, even,
Yeah.
Century.
Again, there's many threads there. I mean, and there's many things coming to my mind, but the position that you're emphasizing, that it's not that the 20th century was anti-metaphysics, it was that it was physicalist metaphysics, I think is a really important one, because it's like, yeah, like, and as you emphasize in the paper, there's no way out of metaphysics. And if you think there's a way out of metaphysics, all that's going to happen is that you're going to fall into an uncritical metaphysics.
Yeah.
Right. And you're not even going to be aware of your metaphysics. And like, and then, this is a situation which is pervading all of academia. And I just wonder, specifically in your example of the bees and sentience, is like, I don't know if this is just because I was really influenced by the tradition of Maturana and Varela's autopoiesis, but like, with the concept of autopoiesis specifically, and that tradition of life sciences is like, well, sentience is just tied to life. Like, so I don't know, like that was always my impression. And I know you're a panpsychist. So what do you see as the relationship? Well, one, like, what do you think of that view? And then also, what is the connection potentially to a panpsychism? And of course, in your metaphysical matrix, panpsychism has a place, and so maybe might want to talk about the relationship to that.
Yeah, these questions are like intense, but they're really, really interesting. So yeah, with autopoiesis from Varela, I like I read the original paper and some others, and yeah, no, I did like the idea, but I just thought it was arbitrary in the sense that they use the cell wall, the membrane, don't they, as a sort of the cutoff point of what is sentient, without a real explanation. It's like, well, we have to choose somewhere, so let's choose that. They never seem to give a sufficient explanation as to why we had to cut life off at that membrane stage. So I was always a bit skeptical of that, and that meant that, of course, that you couldn't go further down, as it were, in terms of like viruses or molecules, organic molecules, atoms, whatever. But panpsychism would accept some kind of unit like a molecule as being partly sentient. Like basically sentient. So I think that cutoff point where you say anything above this complexity is sentient, anything below it is insentient, I just think I can't buy that, really. I think it's more parsimonious to say it's just sentient all the way down. There is no cutoff point. I don't see a reason for a cutoff point. If you take, mind and matter, if you take matter to be an abstraction, which includes mind. Now, I'm going personally to my own metaphysics, which is perhaps a bit more Spinoza and Whiteheadian. So this is, I'm now speaking not as a neutral observer, but as a personal philosopher. So I think the concept of matter is an abstraction, therefore, and I think mind is part of that concrete reality. Therefore, I wouldn't stop at the cell membrane. Panpsychism doesn't stop. That's what makes it pan, as it were. And there's, that's not really a reason for believing panpsychism, but it's why I wouldn't really accept autopoiesis in its pure form. What was the second thing? Panpsychism.
Just that might tie in nicely to, so panpsychism was in you have a metaphysical matrix questionnaire where it's, even though you like you just say, you're just speaking from your personal position with panpsychism on there, but in your metaphysical matrix, you have all of the different metaphysical positions, or at least you say it's not total, it's not exhaustive, but that there's a certain matrix of different metaphysical positions which might correlate with a psychedelic experience and might be useful to work through or think through. So I'd be interested, how do you differentiate between, your personal metaphysical view and the ecology or species of different metaphysical views, and their potential relations? Because I feel like one of the big risks and challenges in this move, which is at the same time essential, from mysticism to metaphysics and combining the two, is that metaphysics is based on logic, argument, explanation. So we could run into conflict, disagreement. Like, whereas with mysticism, it's like, you had a mystical experience on 5-MeO-DMT, I had a mystical experience on 5-MeO-DMT, right? Yeah, we both had a mystical experience, but then we might, in our mediation of that and in our logical argumentation of trying to approach our understanding of reality, have different metaphysical conclusions.
Yeah, it's quite right, and I don't think we'll ever come to the end of that discussion, but yeah, you're quite right, and the qualification there, of course, is that number of psychedelic experiences can be delusive. That's of course a possibility, and in fact, maybe it must be, some of them must be delusive if we consider people having experiences which are contradictory to one another, like dualism and monism, for example. Interestingly, is another little aside here. When we did the factor analysis of the questionnaire, it seems that people generally can hold inconsistent beliefs. So you can have which is for a philosopher very, disconcerting, really, not harmonious. So like someone believes in free will and determinism at the same time, for example, they sort of factor together. And there's a whole other paper on why that might happen. It could just simply be that people are inconsistent in their beliefs, or it could be a number of explanations for that. But with panpsychism, and coming back, so you notice that there's, in the metaphysics matrix, there's I think 5 columns. There's physicalism, for us to that, dualism, idealism, neutral monism, and the transcendent, meaning sort of forms or different dimensional realities. And then, so those are the 5 columns. And then, but I've got panpsychism cutting through them as a row. The reason is that panpsychism is kind of a metaphysical view, right? In that you can get like Galen Strawson, for example, who's really the biggest advocate of panpsychism alive today, greatest philosopher, and Peter Strawson's son, Kantian. He considers panpsychism to be physicalism, as really did Karl Popper. He calls it real naturalism. But you can be a panpsychist and a dualist as well, like some animism seems to be like that, so you think that like a plant has a soul that might survive it. It's a very rare view, but it can exist. You can be idealist and panpsychist. So like typical example, Schopenhauer, really, I think, and so on and so forth. So that's why it cuts through that. And of course, you're neutral monist and panpsychist. That's the classic Spinozism, really. So yeah, it's tricky, but and another reason that panpsychism stood out is because, interestingly, panpsychism is, there was a number of studies, but it started with Chris Timmerman's study at Imperial a few years ago, 2021, I think it was, a couple of years ago. showing that, well, small study, so it's just indicative, suggestive, but showed that people undergoing a momentous psychedelic experience, generally speaking, shifted from physicalism to panpsychism, which is an interesting find. But when you really delve into it, and I know you saw my talk with Chris Timmerman, the definitions of panpsychism and dualism and physicalism, for that matter, all the definitions were quite vague. So you don't really know what the shift was, because you don't really know what they meant when they said that.
You were saying in the talk that maybe there's a job for you there.
Yeah, exactly. I know. But anyway, also just indicative of the fact that this requires a lot more research, But it's very exciting research, It's like research that could change. I don't want to sound like a Californian, but it could change the world, right, for the better. I mean, it's sort of. Schopenhauer spoke of a metaphysical need that we all have, and religion doesn't satisfy that need anymore. So maybe psychedelics are offering this, and like by bringing in metaphysics, now you don't have to go into any extremist cult-like position,
Well, I remember, maybe this is a personal anecdote that might be interesting here in the context of the relationship between the project that you're forwarding in this paper and religion not filling the hole, so to speak, anymore, is that I remember after my first psychedelic experience, my first thought being like, this is the baby in the bathwater. Like all of what I saw was the bathwater, the dirty bathwater of metaphysics or traditional religion, being like, this is the baby, meaning that this is the special jewel. And if we don't have contact with this special jewel, and if we don't have the right containers and mediation for this jewel, then we lose the baby, and we just get the bathwater.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is, I quite agree. I think this is the danger, isn't it? That, you have this amazing metaphysical experience that changes your life, but maybe only just for a week, when you don't realize what it means. You can't apply it to yourself, can't apply it to yourself within nature, within the cosmos, and then it's lost. And that's because I think the ideology of your culture will creep back into you quickly. That's why there's a need to sort of keep that open, keep those possibilities open, that sense of wonder at the very least open.
I want to give
that's why it's dangerous to talk about this. Michael Pollan coined it, and it's continued by Chris Leatherby to a certain extent, although he's more open-minded about it. But this term called the comforting delusion objection, which very basically is the objection that we shouldn't help people with psychedelics because it helps by inducing delusions upon people, which is unethical. But of course, that then is, that then sort of assumes that one knows what reality is. So to determine something to be a delusion, of course, this is the metaphysical question. There's no agreement upon that. So it's a kind of like, you have to be always careful of this underlying ideology of physicalism, or materialism, or whatever you want to call it, that sort of underlies a lot of thought without people being aware of it. So it's useful to bring it to light. Let's talk about what you're assuming here in even coining such a term or creating such an ethical issue.
Absolutely. I was just thinking on regards to this, I like your point about you're assuming what what delusion is. You're assuming what what reality is. And I remember thinking that that was one of my first attractions to psychoanalysis, was that they took the fantasy as an objective inquiry. We're gonna take dreams seriously. We're gonna take your fantasies at night seriously, and that for me has changed, or at least that's an example of where a metaphysical presupposition of what a fantasy or a delusion is gets rethought. But
in anthropology, they've gone through the so-called ontological turn, which means that they now look, there's a kind of charitable methodology in anthropology, apparently, that they just decide to take as true the beliefs and reports of the people they study, sort of swinging from the other side of things, where they talk about these primitive people who believe in all kinds of superstition, to the other side of fully accepting it. I don't know how consistent that will be in the long term, because if they applied that to themselves and their own methodologies, you sort of get sort of begins to implode, you know, and the ethical, you apply that to your own ethics and you get into some kind of nihilistic abyss, you know. But anyway, I think it might be useful to a bit like chaos magic as well, if you know about that, you know, where you sort of just take on a role for a while and just sort of live with it and see how it affects you. Personally, I do, okay, you call me a panpsychist, and I suppose I am. I've got a PhD in it, and I do sort of believe it, but I generally tend to say that I entertain beliefs rather than sort of really adopt them, you know.
Well, I'm sorry if I know it's not good to throw identity. I know it's weird, but just because it is a position that you talk about a lot.
Yeah, no, but you're right. Anyway, I would, in this case, I call myself a panpsychist. You know, I can't avoid that. But generally speaking, with other things, I'm kind of like, you know, maybe, you know, but maybe not, you know. As you know, the more philosophy you study, right, the more critical you become of anything. You know, you see all the criticisms over the years of any position you take, and it sort of, you know, makes you hesitant to really adopt.
In regards to the ontological turn idea in anthropology, where you just take as true the beliefs and reports of the people, it reminds me of Lacan's little quip that truth has the structure of a fiction. That we can't have we can't make this simple distinction between truth and fiction, that we have to think about them and that doesn't just mean like all fictions are equal or something like that, but at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, interestingly, the British idealist F.H. Bradley also speaks now. The ultimate truth is the absolute, and you know, we you know, it's impossible to know the truth because we can never become it. Well, as Bergson speaks about different degrees of self, even, you know, we think of the self and the not self, but maybe that's just a way of conceptualizing reality. That's another interesting thing related to autopoiesis to a certain extent. You know, maybe certain organisms have a less unified sense of their self, which can break down into multiple parts and then maybe come together when there's a threat, for example. You know, we won't know that because by looking at the correlates, well, we can't even, by looking at their body, we can't get the phenomenological reports, you know. It's the whole Nagel thing. So yeah, anyway, it's I just say it because it's also related to this platitude in psychedelic circles known as ego dissolution. You know, it kind of assumes a certain metaphysics that the ego exists. They know what that means. It can be dissolved in the way in which they know, but of course they don't know.
Well, I think that presupposition is based on the neurocorrelates.
It could be, so
I mean, but that would be based on that presupposition, because like in the research that I have done on that, what seems to be signified with the idea of ego dissolution is that there's a certain default mode network.
Yeah, well, yeah, if you're specific about it, yeah, that's fine. But I'm just saying that I don't think people generally are. I mean, you know, like in philosophy, the idea of the self, you can do whole modules on that, you know, different, you know, look at Kant, for example, pure apperception, empirical apperception, sense experience, and so on. You know, there's just but again, it's where metaphysics comes in handy. Where, so if you're going to talk about, like, if you want to look at the neural correlates, let's say you're doing, you know, neuroscientific study on the neural correlates of DMT experience or whatever, psilocybin, and someone reports ego dissolution, then you're going to have a look at what happens in the brain. Well, okay, but what do you mean by ego dissolution? How does the person reporting it understand that, you know? And that's where, like, actually not just metaphysics, but phenomenology becomes very important as well. You can't map correlates without knowing what you're mapping it to, which is the phenomenologist's task. And that's a whole other area of research for philosophers, you know, mapping a new phenomenology of psychedelic experience. Benny Shannon started this a little bit, you know, in his book.
I love that book.
Yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? Antipodes of the Mind. He talks about the metaphysical structures of it as well. As does Albert Hoffman. You know, Albert Hoffman actually, you know, he didn't trigger this, but I came across the quotation when I was writing it that, you know, he said, like, there's a metaphysical hunger in people, and we should look at a metapsychology or therapy which involves metaphysics, you know, looking at this. Of course, he said that because he was very good friends with this great German writer, philosopher called Ernst Jünger. I don't know if not many people have come across him in the English-speaking world, but Heidegger called him the true continuer of Nietzsche.
Wow.
And he wrote this book in 1970.
And if anyone was going to say something like that, I mean, Heidegger, right?
Exactly. Ernst Jünger, you know, he fascinating character, quite controversial, because his first book was about First World War and his experience of it as a soldier, and it was almost glorified violence to a certain extent. And then he was, as a German, he had to work for the Nazis, but so he was a captain in the Second World War in Paris. But he refused to join the Nazi party, and then he was loosely involved with the assassination attempt on Hitler. So you can sort of forgive him, but he thought Hitler was a bit too left-wing. Anyway, interestingly, he became very good friends with Albert Hoffman, who discovered or created LSD. And in Hoffman's 1979 book, LSD, My Problem Child, one chapter is devoted to Ernst Jünger. And Jünger was very much into metaphysics. And he's a beautiful writer. A new English translation of his book, Approaches, Drugs and Intoxications, just come out. Very good translation. And I really recommend it. It's actually for philosophers, it's probably the greatest book on psychedelics. It's really, really beautiful book. And in that book, he coins the term psychonaut. Comes from him.
That's a fantastic little bridge into a history that is new to me, and maybe one that I'll have to explore more after this conversation.
Yeah, no, you really should. It's so rich. There's also correspondence he had with Heidegger. Just I think he's one of these philosophers who will become better known over time. Now he died about 20 years ago, I suppose.
It's certainly the case that oftentimes great philosophers are not, fully discovered or fully appreciated until after their time is very common, I suppose. And
like artists, yeah.
And I mean, who knows how many undiscovered gems there really are out there. And that's another reason why it's important, I think, to have a more open, broad philosophical study and philosophy in the future, is so that we can discover people who are perhaps undiscovered and discover also people who are sort of psychedelically open or mystically open. They might be precisely the right people to engage in those types of research projects because they're so presuppositionless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one group of philosophers I've recently come upon last few years is like I mentioned already, the British idealists. It's an amazing school of thought, and the influenced by Hegel mostly, but also Kant and others, Spinoza to a certain extent. And whether they're really idealists is actually another question. But amazing thinkers. F.H. Bradley, fantastic thinker. Very, lost really to the English-speaking world in many ways. But he was brilliant, really. Died in 1925, I think, and he was just dismissed because of logical positivism. It's a real pity, So Samuel Alexander, another great philosopher, who's kind of like not very well known now, but very interesting.
I just have to bring this up because I just have been teaching on it, and so it's fresh in my mind. But I was teaching on Hegel's idea of truth in the last section of The Science of Logic, and he has this distinction between analytic thinking and synthetic thinking, and he goes into like what is analytic thinking and what is synthetic thinking and all that. And what I tried to do for the students in sort of communicating the difference between the two is like logical positivism falls so neatly, all of the schools of thought in logical positivism fit so neatly into what Hegel's talking about as analytic thought. And then synthetic thought is basically like this type of thinking, which is like not totalizable, but like all sorts of thinkers like a Bergson or a Whitehead or the idealist tradition, like they're just, it's almost like logical positivists just pretend that doesn't exist.
I mean, it's an interesting distinction that was made. I think Whitehead called it speculative metaphysics, which is not analytic. It's speculative, but that's really in other words, synthesizing new ideas, creating new coherent structures of thought systems that you can then analyze, thereafter. But if you're just going to stick on, and he was actually critical of the positivists, if you're just going to analyze things, you're never going to move forward, and so speculative metaphysics, synthetic thought really has also been lost. I think philosophy just became a little bit boring, to be honest, in the 20th century. I think science completely took over in the West.
I remember something I thought, which I really wanted to bring up earlier, which was because of, and actually this came up in a conversation I had recently with Peter Rollins, who's a very interesting thinker, I think, is that he had a mystical experience when he was young, And then he went to university and was exposed to analytic philosophy. And he was like, I don't like this stuff. This stuff is like basically I'm saying that if you have a mystical experience and all you have access to is analytic philosophy, it's going to turn you off the philosophical enterprise as such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a dangerous thing. But there was this horrible divide in the 20th century as well between analytic and continental philosophy, you know, and you know, Bergson's a great thinker, like Foucault and Deleuze and so on, but there's so much rubbish in that continental side as well as, and there's so much triviality in the analytic side that if you went to the university to study one or the other, you're like, well, okay, this is not really the subject, not particularly an interesting subject, you know. But it was never really like that. I suppose you could always study the classics at least, you know, the 7 big philosophers, and so that made up for it. Luckily, Nietzsche as well was always enticing to young men, you know. So luckily I avoided it. But dangerous divide, very dangerous divide.
Good on you. I mean,
analytic philosophy now is kind of getting a lot of stick, isn't it? It's getting criticized for being ahistorical and not understanding its context and being pedantic, which is true. Although having said all that, I do like aspects. I mean, philosophy of mind is pretty analytic, and I do like to get into the thorough analysis of things.
I wanted to actually bring up a quote from your paper by someone who I think is often categorized as an analytic philosopher, Bertrand Russell. But the quote that you use from Russell in your paper is, in my view, fantastic. And I think that I'll just want to read it here because I think it captures and maybe expand a little bit again on what I think is so important in your contrasting between mysticism and metaphysics, where you have basically this view that mysticism is sort of a pure revelation, whereas metaphysics is more of an argumentation. And here the quote from Bertrand Russell is, "Metaphysics, or the attempt to conceive the world as a whole by means of thought, has been developed by the union and conflict of 2 very different human impulses, the one urging men towards mysticism, the other urging them towards science." And I think that quote is just fantastic because when I was growing up and when I was becoming an intellectual, I certainly had the urge to become scientific cultivated inside of me. But the urge to become mystical was less cultivated and ignored. And I had to discover that path on my own and then sort of play with the conflict between the two sort of on my own. And I would be interested to know what your view is of how these 2 paths can be more consciously cultivated.
Yeah, well, I think the first step is to a Western mind, thinking now generalizing to thoughtful people in the West. The first thing to say is like, you can have a metaphysical mind without being religious in any sense. So I think decoupling that, and without being extremist or strange or something like this, but understanding that there are these really interesting deep metaphysical positions which people like Bertrand Russell posit. He became almost like a panpsychist really later, and he was believed in universals for most of his life as well. Transcendent universals, another aspect of metaphysics. I think that you have to point out that this is not a religious stance. This is a secular, intelligent stance, number one. And that if you don't consider it, you are, as you said before, taking on an uncritical metaphysics. You're sort of that. If you don't think about it, then you will be assimilated into what already exists. And I think if you put that to people, no one wants to be ignorant, right? So that becomes an important matter. With regards to Bertrand Russell, I mean, that's from a great essay, Logic and Mysticism. And, Bertrand Russell himself, very interesting character, because he had a mystical experience in Whitehead's house, interestingly. And he said that one experience, he was looking at the suffering of Whitehead's wife. She had a seizure, and then he had a sort of seizure, his mystical experience. And he said that one experience changed him from an imperialist, who's from the British Whig family, a big aristocratic family here in Britain. His grandfather was actually Prime Minister of Britain, Lord Russell. It changed him from a British imperialist to a pacifist immediately, that one experience. Now, it doesn't always go that way. You can also turn the other way. But that changed him. And, he spent time in prison for protesting the war and so on. So
it's remarkable that
people, but then, sorry, he wrote also Why I'm Not a Christian, which lost him a job in America. And he's known as a famous atheist and a great writer, one of the best writers of the English language. But he was not averse to mysticism, as long as he juxtaposed it to logic, and he didn't see them as antagonistic. He saw them as coherent, and psychologically, as you say, the two sort of psychological motives that pull on people. One is science, one is this mystical, and metaphysics really then is somewhere in the middle. Brings together those two strands.
That correlates really well with my experience. So maybe not neural correlates, but some sort of correlate. But no, it's very interesting to bring these two strands together, and I do sort of sympathize with, well, I mean, perhaps it's simply the situation that people in the West correlated mysticism with Christianity and then threw Christianity out and then think, well, I've got to throw mysticism out as well. Yeah. But I think that would be the example of the baby in the bathwater situation.
And I think there's also danger in the USA, especially because this is now very anecdotal, but when I look at the US, I see it as a polarized nation. Everything needs to be polarized. I remember 15 years ago or something, this evolutionary argument, with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, like Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, and Sam Harris. It was all like it was all in the news and everything. And I even went to see Richard Dawkins' book launch of The God Delusion. And but I remember speaking even today, actually in a Swiss conference a few months ago. This is for you, like with evolution, for example, we all believe in evolution, but I think there's missing parts of evolution. For example, what's the place of mental causation within evolution? This is a very interesting question, it's a legitimate question. It's partly answered by sexual selection, but there's much more to it there. And teleology as well, relatedly. Now, it's like, I remember having conversations about this with some, biologists in America, and they're like, no, we can't accept that. That's basically a creationist. Do you think the Earth is 6,000? It's like saying the Earth is 6,000 years old. So I've come across a lot of like bifurcation of thought in America, and I think with metaphysics, that might be a danger there. I think Europeans, generally speaking, are a bit more open-minded to it, but there could be this fear that if you accept any modicum of metaphysics, that means you're part of that side. Doesn't mean that at all, of course. Shouldn't be thought of that way, but it's a danger that we can fall into.
It's certainly the structure of the new atheist moment, where there's this quite strong divide between the two, basically the divide between science and mysticism sort of getting lumped up in a sort of religious fundamentalist camp, which is itself, this is a false binary, right? We have to think beyond this. And I think actually, what I've been thinking through is this relationship between Darwinism and Hegelianism, and that conversation is actually one that needs to be had. Like, if I was to hold a conference, I would want to bring together Darwinists and Hegelianists, because it's interesting, because it's basically and broader outside of Hegelianism. I would say, what is the relationship between idealism and evolutionism?
Yeah.
And I think that would be an interesting conference to engage. I mean, on a serious level, because there might be consequences on the level of biogenetics and synthetic biology and like very practical things, like not just
no. Absolutely. I mean, you should set that conference up. I would go. I mean, sometimes I think Darwin, the sort of milieu of Hegelianism probably gave a lot of impetus to Darwin, to the theory of evolution and Darwinian evolution, especially, this notion that, of progress in society and so on, sort of conflict resolving and so on. I'm sure there's a lot to be said about that, which isn't said. And also, the other aspects of evolution, which might be idealist to some extent, which then, relate to things like mental causation and, teleology, certainly, I think teleology is again one of these things that's completely lost in the 20th century as an aspect of metaphysics, which was just irrelevant, completely false, and a wrong way of looking at the world.
Do you think Marxism contributed to the downfall of teleology?
I think so. I mean, I haven't really researched this, so I don't want to say too much, but obviously Marx had a large influence on the West, and even though we were not Marxist countries, there was a cultural influence, especially on universities, and of course Marx as materialist. This had a big influence. So you had this two-pronged attack, really, of Marx, the stampede of science. Also, psychoanalysis, of course, had its sort of materialistic background as well, to a certain extent. So Freud, Marx, Darwin. I don't know if Darwin fits into that group, really. But these three figures, and then Nietzsche. Nietzsche didn't have an effect, really, on English-speaking world much. But yeah, it's a really, I think it did, but, you know, one can only speculate. It's very hard to really gauge the extent of influence, you know, and even if you, it means you're generalizing all the time, you know, like Marx might have influenced one scientist and not another. So, but yeah, certainly, again, a lot of research can be put into it. I'm sure it has already to a certain extent. I haven't read it though.
I'm thinking about like the idea that there's a telos to world history that we know, and that we can be agents acting in relationship to. Like, we know that world communism is the destiny of history, and we know the path to get there. And this, I think, is maybe the notion of teleology, which people want to get away from.
Yeah, if you see it in that restricted sense, I'm sure. But then, of course, there is always, although it's sort of explicitly rejected, implicitly, you know, like the survival instinct, for example, or the desire for food or sex or whatever it may be. These are teloi, you know, these are different. These are forms.
Oh, no question.
But
I know where I'm going after our conversation, for example.
Exactly, right. Forethought, planning, you know. In fact, everything you do, really. I mean, if you believe in intentionality as the condition for consciousness, then you can't avoid it. But it can't be. What is it, though? That's the question. You know, what is it? And if it can't be reduced to, you know, neurons firing, whatever, neurotransmitters passing between synapses, then it can't be a thing. When you reduce explanation to that, then you lose so much of reality. And this is what's happened, you know, reduction to mechanism. This also, I mean, there's another aspect to it as well. There's Marxism, to some extent, also in industrialism, you know, because, you know, Collingwood wrote this great book called The Idea of Nature, published in 1940, I think, 1941. But he says there's three ways of looking at Western history. There's the Greek analogy of nature is an organism. So like the society is an organism, a republic or whatever. The cosmos is a giant organism, perhaps. And then we've entered now the modern age, which is the analogy of nature is the machine. Of course, machines per se don't have intrinsic teleology. They're given teleology, you know, the program to do this or that. And then he said there's a third stage now, which is the evolutionary analogy metaphor, interestingly. He wrote that in 1940, where we think about things in terms of progression towards a goal, which is more Hegelian, I suppose. But that never really took on, not in Britain anyway. He was, you know, an Oxford philosopher. So, yeah, but again, like even talking about that to most people is completely alien. They wouldn't, you know, it's just, this is how metaphysics works in terms of ideology. It just becomes a background. I was like, I was raised in English school, mostly, a little bit in Sweden. But, you know, I was taught, for example, that vitalism was mentioned once in a science class, I remember, a biology class. And it was like, well, you know, people used to believe that, but we know now that, you know, this is not true because of X, Y, and Z. And all the students were like, okay, right, thanks. It's just another bit of information for the exam. And this is how it works, you know. It's, I mean, even the teacher is not conscious of it really as an open question.
Well, let's connect the telos to this conversation in regards to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because you're in a very interesting position, both intellectually, socially, and philosophically, I suppose, in regards to the future of this cultural transformation. Where do you think psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is going? What do you see? And what do you think are the concrete steps we can take to resolve what I agree with you is a big problem, is this ambiguous nature of the word integration?
Yeah. Well, Well,
hopefully these are good questions.
They're just, yeah. Well, I'll just have a little stab at it, I suppose. Where's it going? I mean, okay, so psychedelic assisted therapy is deemed to become a multi-billion-dollar industry within the next 5 years. There's separate figures you can find online, but a lot of money. So that's why there's a lot of investment in it now. You go to these conferences, psychedelic conferences, you see a lot of investors there, business people, and as well as doctors, medical doctors, and so on. So I think the next step will be that, like a sort of increase of medicalization of psychedelics for therapy. Already Australia's just legalized MDMA and psilocybin for therapy, haven't they? We see it in some states in America as well, and other countries, Portugal. That'll be the next step. And I think that will actually is an important step in the Hegelian sense to reach the next one, right? Because people can't, it's very hard to be against therapy. Someone says, oh, we shouldn't do this. How can you not want to help people? So this is one way of beginning to reintroduce psychedelic substances and modes of being back into society. It's a way of making them acceptable to the mainstream. We don't need to go the same path as we did in the 60s at all. But the danger, of course, is that then it's monopolized by the medical industry. And that would be a great pity if that were to happen. So the next step, I think, is to create a kind of, well, this is quite a personal view now, but I think that the next step would be to show how they can be societally beneficial as well. And that would involve more than medicine. It would involve metaphysics, philosophy, generally ethics, aesthetics, phenomenology, as we've been discussing. And so my hope would be that these things, become integrated in society, and therefore people become, gain that I'm not saying they gain any insight into truth necessarily, but they enrich their life, and people become more metaphysically aware, both experientially and then intellectually. This is just a hope, really. I don't know if it's feasible at all. And then, with our new postgraduate course at Exeter starting in January, we've called it Psychedelics, Mind, Medicine, and Culture. So we are already trying to push it in that direction of culture and not just medicine. And by mind, we're talking about philosophy, mind, metaphysics, and neuroscience as well. So I hope that there's this, more fields, more disciplines get involved with this, anthropology as well, history, theology, so on. They all contribute intellectually to this movement. And also when you get more academics talking about it, it becomes more acceptable as well. Because a great fear, of course, is that the prohibition will just continue. People will be put into prison for taking these things, and they become completely inaccessible and faux pas. This is, as they are now, really. So this is, so I think we have to fight against that. We have to make them more respectable by showing how valuable they can be.
It's something I've reflected on a lot since being exposed to psychedelics, is the substances which a culture deems legal and the substances which a culture deems as illegal. And thinking about the substances that our society runs on, like going back to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the introduction of coffee into English society, for example, or the fact that in the 20th century, our culture and my family seemed to revolve around cigarettes and booze. And cigarettes and booze were just 5 minutes away down the store in either direction. Whereas ayahuasca, I had to find some weird location where we're practicing in secret, and actually we might be shut down at any moment. And you're just given this tremendous divine encounter, which ruptures your entire perception of and way of seeing and way of being. And
it's interesting, isn't it, how those drugs affect society? I mean, like you say, coffee. Imagine, rush hour without coffee, or tea here in England. Or sugar. Sugar was introduced, I think, to England around 13th century. Was it that? Around that, but it's, like completely changed. Well, nowadays it's just part and parcel of our food. We don't even consider it to be a drug, but it is, of course.
Exactly. And that's an interesting thing when the drug has become so normalized that it's no longer a drug. or whatever, the way we put words on these things, like the difference between a drug and an entheogen or something like that. But I just want to say that when I was first exposed to the psychedelic culture, usually there's this binary between we're doing psychedelics for some sort of trauma, medicine, healing, or we're doing psychedelics because we're exploring the nature of the mind. And I think that the third dimension that you're emphasizing, culture, is something that we do need to work on. We do need to bring that more into the forefront and into the discussion. And I do think philosophy is necessary for that. So I don't know if you've had a relationship to those two distinctions of the more therapeutic medicinal side, the mind exploration side, but then there's that cultural side. And maybe, what do you think? What do you think about how do we bring that more into the discourse?
Yeah, well, I think the healing side I've had experience with the people, the therapists at Exeter, ketamine, 5-MeO, and so on. I see that it's become very, psychologized, as it were, kind of dried, clinical, literally. And then a lot of people do say, they don't refer to drugs, as you were saying, they refer to medicine, but I think it's much more than medicine, so that's very restrictive, just calling them medicine as well. They can be used as curses as well, don't forget, in the Americas and Africa. And then, exploring the mind. Well, I think, I think that's a very useful thing, but I think, it's good to have guidance. Some people, I've learned a lot from others, and as we all have, and it's not imposing ideas onto people, but helping them explore it with different concepts and different modes of accessing the mind, meditation, for example, and so on. So I think with regard to that aspect, there are entry points for philosophy as well. But I think, with the wider picture of culture, nature, I mean, it relates to all of it, doesn't it? Because Whitehead always complained that, we have this so-called mind-body problem, mind-matter problem, instead of the mind-nature problem. Where, it already assumes, by saying that, it already assumes a kind of enclosed sense of what the mind is. And I think that when we think about the mind in relation to nature, as opposed to in relation to one's own body alone, or even in relation to a group, that immediately opens up philosophical, metaphysical, ethical questions, which will just enrich people's experience. Not the experience itself, but also afterwards, reflecting upon it, thinking about it, talking about it with others, if you've got just different ways of, perceiving that experience, it's going to enrich your life. And so, that final step is the relationship ultimately between the self, your what you consider to be yourself, and the cosmos. And I don't think we'll ever reach an answer, but it could be a new, interesting path that we take in our civilization. A new, not a new religion, but a new, new way of understanding reality, a more open way of understanding reality, which doesn't have to be denominational at all. But I would imagine kickback from that. You'd get certain religions which are like wouldn't like it. So
that's what I'm thinking about as well. Is that this seems to me, in terms of our sensibilities, I can definitely get on board with a culture which not only cultivates a deep scientific aim, but a deep mystical aim, and then you're open towards a path or a becoming, which is not easy to put a label onto.
No.
And then there will be people who want to contain it with a denominational label, perhaps. And what do you think is the ethics of that situation? What do you think is the philosophical disposition, perhaps, that helps us navigate that kickback or that conservative reactionaryism?
Yeah. First thing that springs to mind is that there have been attempts to create like psychedelic religions with a kind of manifesto and so on, which I've always been against. It immediately restricts you, and the reason for that is that, you become like a unified group, and therefore you've got certain rights and so on, belief system. The danger is it becomes cult very quickly, and it restricts any other forms of thought outside of that manifesto, whatever it might be. I don't think that's the right path at all. In terms of conservatism, well, I try to stay apolitical, as much as possible. Probably completely impossible. But I tell you, MAPS, who is a big American organization who are sort of promoting MDMA against PTSD, they had an interesting methodology for stalling an attack by conservatism to a certain extent, and that was to bring in veterans who were suffering PTSD immediately into the trials of MDMA. So healing veterans, and their demographic is generally conservative, apparently. That forestalled people having a go at the endeavor, because that would be having a go at war veterans, which would be considered even worse than taking psychedelics, really. So that's one practical way in which one can do it. I think another, generally speaking, though, that if we're talking about practical politics, you have to not exclude, don't get too nichey with a certain demographic of people. I mean, I'm in many different worlds, and that's fine, that works well. And I think this is how psychedelics really should move on. They shouldn't get devolved into any one group, and that includes clinicians, because then you'll start to lose people who are excluded from that group. And I don't want to say inclusiveness, because I hate these kind of modern terms. But
no. I see what you're. I like that as well. I can see what you're trying to navigate there.
Yeah.
And I do think that kind of like, I don't know, of course, but I do think that in the same way that when people avoid metaphysics, you can fall into uncritical metaphysics. I think that in some sense that can happen with politics as well. Like if you avoid politics, you fall into an uncritical politics or something like that. Like but there is also this impossibility, like of confronting the political situation, which is, it's hard to do. And it's a lot of the times it's about sensitivities and, I like the idea of inhabiting, sorry.
It's a hard one, but I like Nietzsche's idea of just being interested in ground politics, not party politics. If I got involved with British party politics, it would just be a complete waste of time with their pettiness and so on.
No, totally.
But that's not what you mean. I know what you mean. I don't think I can avoid politics. I realize that, but nonetheless.
No, I feel you. I feel you. And in regards to the I am in many different worlds, it reminds me of what Nietzsche talks about in regards to filling your cup with many glasses, like to expose yourself to many different viewpoints, and to be able and to be able, just like what he talks about in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, about exposing himself to many different cultures and seeing all of their value systems pointing towards the overman. It's this there's this singularity within the multiplicity of the overman and the will to power that is in some sense guiding us.
There's another whole interesting research unit, the notion of teleology in relationship to the Übermensch, in relationship to psychedelic states, related to what Carpenter calls cosmic consciousness to a certain extent.
How many research programs have we discovered in this conversation?
I don't know. But you can. All right. Some of them are.
Well, okay. It's been a very, very enriching conversation for me. So thank you for coming on. I just in terms of closing or pointing towards a close, I just want to re-emphasize to people that that your paper on the need for the metaphysics and psychedelic therapy and research will be linked in the description. And I do think that what you're up to, and specifically pinpointing this ambiguity of the integrative phase, is so crucial for thinking and so crucial for the future of philosophy. So thanks for that. And maybe just ask you for some concluding thoughts about the idea of the integrative phase and the relationship between psychedelics and philosophy that you might want to leave people with, and maybe directions that they might want to explore in your work.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I really enjoyed this conversation as well. It's really nice to speak to a fellow philosopher. Often that doesn't happen. Even at Exeter, I'm speaking mostly to psychologists. So I've really enjoyed this. So thanks a lot. I really mean that. Secondly, pointers. By pure chance, my book is here, Philosophy and Psychedelics, published by Bloomsbury.
I'll leave that in the description.
So I've written the introduction to that with Christina Housekeller, but I've also got a chapter on Spinozism. There's a number of chapters on Whitehead there from other authors, and very interesting other facets of philosophy, the intertwinement of philosophy and psychedelics. It's an edited volume. What else can I say? I mean, well, from a practical point of view, University of Exeter now, we're hosting Europe's largest psychedelic conference, which went extremely well last week, breaking convention, and I think it will stay there. So I'd really recommend people to come there to get a really good interdisciplinary view of psychedelics as well. So I had a panel on mind and metaphysics, but there's also panels on all kinds of things, African use of psychedelics, decolonization, ketamine therapy, as well as art, cinema, art installations, and so on, stalls. It was amazing. So yeah, look to Exeter as well. I said there's this course we're creating, PG certificates that can go after your name, and maybe that will develop into a Masters of Science soon. That's starting in January 2024. That will be a science and social science, so for the comprehensive view. What else? Yeah, I mean, probably the best.
Maybe dates for the. I'll leave a link in the description, but maybe dates for the breaking convention if people want to get in touch and attend that.
Yeah, well, this year, for the first time, it started in April, mid-April. So Bicycle Day, April 19th. Named after Albert Hoffman's bicycle ride after first intentionally taking LSD. So that's April. It normally happens every 2 years, but it might happen now every year. We don't know yet. There's a date, January 2024, for the course. You can register your interest online there. Go to my Twitter account and you get all this information. To be honest, that's the best source of information for me. My Twitter handle, Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. Otherwise, I've got the website philosopher.eu. It's my personal website, which got some information. I don't know. Or just email me, peter@philosopher.eu.
You've got a great domain name there.
I was so lucky with that. It's just unbelievable. And I almost
philosopher.eu. I looked at it, I was like, he's got that domain.
I almost lost it because of Brexit, so after Brexit, British people couldn't have .eu suffixes anymore. But because my mother's Swedish, I luckily retained it, very on the edge. So yeah. Yeah. So
right.
Probably enough. Too much, maybe.
All right. Well, everything there will be in the description, so that the too much can at least on this level be contained. And yeah, I just want to again thank you so much, and strongly recommend for anyone who's interested in either philosophy or psychedelics or both to check out the paper on the need for metaphysics and metaphysical therapy and research, and specifically to be thinking about not just the psychedelic experience, the mystical state, but also the metaphysical dimension and the philosophical mediation, which I think is so crucial and will become more and more needed, not just for medicinal or not just for mental exploration, but also, as Dr. Sjöstedt-Hughes emphasized, for culture and for society. So with that being said, I will leave you here. Thanks so much.